Racism against Black Americans has deep historical roots in the United States, beginning with the colonial era and persisting into the 21st century. From the earliest African arrivals through the Civil War, most African Americans endured the horrors of slavery. Even after emancipation, they faced severe restrictions on their political, social, and economic rights, enduring violence, segregation, and discriminatory laws such as the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws. The civil rights movement marked progress in dismantling formal racial discrimination, but racism still lingers in American society, manifesting in stark socioeconomic disparities. Recent research reveals ongoing racial discrimination across various sectors, from the criminal justice system and businesses to housing, healthcare, media, and politics. The United Nations and the US Human Rights Network emphasize that discrimination permeates all aspects of life for communities of color in the US. This raises important questions about the persistence of racism and the need for continued efforts to address it, prompting us to explore how these disparities impact society and what steps can be taken to combat this deeply ingrained issue. In 1790, the Naturalization Act was the first law to establish rules for becoming a US citizen through naturalization. However, it limited citizenship to free white persons, which meant that Native Americans, indentured servants, slaves, free Black people, and later Asians were excluded from becoming citizens. This had significant implications for various legal and political rights, including the right to vote, hold government positions, serve on juries, join the military, and access government services. Even the Second Militia Act of 1792 required conscription only for free, able-bodied white male citizens. While gaining US citizenship didn't automatically grant certain rights, like voting, it was especially challenging for Black Americans. Even though they officially became citizens by 1870, they were quickly stripped of their voting rights. For instance, in the late 1800s, Mississippi had only about 6% of eligible African American voters registered, and Louisiana saw a staggering 99% decrease in registered African American voters from 1896 to 1904. They also faced oppressive laws like the Black Codes and later the Jim Crow laws in the southern states. Voter suppression efforts, often driven by political motives, disproportionately affect African Americans and other minorities. In 2016, 1 in 13 African Americans of voting age couldn't vote, which was more than 4 times the rate for non-African Americans. Florida, for instance, permanently disqualified over 10% of its citizens, including over 23% of African Americans, from voting due to felony disenfranchisement. With that, let's discuss slavery in the United States. Did you know that more than 470,000 Africans were forcibly brought to what is now the United States during the Atlantic slave trade between 1626 and 1860? Prior to the Civil War, 8 presidents of the United States were slaveholders, and slavery was even protected by the United States Constitution. This system of enslavement was immensely profitable for the white elite, with about 1 in 4 Southern families owning Black slaves. The 1860 census reported around 385,000 slave owners among a white population of approximately 7 million in the slave states. To justify this economic exploitation of Black people, white European Americans developed a scientific theory that claimed that white superiority and Black inferiority. Figures like Thomas Jefferson contributed to this idea, asserting that Blacks were inferior in both physical and mental aspects. To control enslaved Black individuals, groups of armed white men known as slave patrols were formed, starting in South Carolina in 1704 and spreading to other slave states. Their primary role was to monitor and police slaves, particularly those attempting to escape. Slave owners were concerned about potential slave revolts, so state militias were also organized to provide military structure and discipline within the slave patrols. This allowed them to detect and suppress any organized gatherings among enslaved people that might lead to uprisings or rebellions. This history highlights the brutal and oppressive nature of slavery in the United States. During the 1820s and 30s, the American Colonization Society proposed a solution to the presence of free Black people by encouraging them to emigrate to Africa. In 1821, they established Liberia as a colony and convinced many former slaves and free Black individuals to move there, sometimes offering freedom in exchange for emigration. This idea was primarily supported in the South, with the founder of ACS, Henry Clay, stating that due to racial prejudice, they believed that free blacks couldn't assimilate with white Americans and needed to be drained off from the country. Were you aware that some American states, like South Carolina in 1824, enacted resolutions emphasizing the importance of subjugating and controlling racial populations, especially black citizens, to prevent insubordination, slave rebellions, and any other causes that might lead to such uprisings? They consider this duty paramount over all other laws, treaties, and agreements. What's your opinion on these historical efforts to encourage the emigration of free black individuals to Liberia, and the extreme measures taken by some states to control and subdue racial populations, particularly in the context of slavery and racial prejudice in the United States? During the American Civil War, the Militia Act of 1862 marked a turning point by allowing African Americans to serve in Union militias as soldiers for the first time. However, they faced discrimination in pay, receiving only half of what white soldiers were paid. Additionally, black soldiers were often given labor duties instead of combat roles. General Daniel Ullman, who led the United States colored troops, expressed concerns that many officials intended to use black soldiers as manual laborers. Black soldiers were organized into colored regiments, and by the war's end in April 1865, there were 175 colored regiments, making up about 1/10 of the Union Army. Tragically, about 20% of these black soldiers died, with a death toll of about 35% higher than that of white Union troops. It's important to note that the 1862 Militia Act allowed black Americans to serve in the military, but it did not open military service to people of all races. In the Confederate Army, non-white men were not allowed to serve as soldiers. But what role would the absence of non-white soldiers in the Confederate Army play in the overall dynamics of the Civil War? President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which took effect on January 1, 1863, signified a shift in the federal government's stance on slavery. Before that, the government had not officially supported emancipation. However, the Emancipation Proclamation had limitations. It didn't apply to nearly 500,000 slaves in border states like Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and West Virginia, nor did it apply to parts of Louisiana and Virginia under Union control. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 granted civil rights to all born in the U.S., and the 14th Amendment in 1868 granted citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the U.S. regardless of race. The 15th Amendment promised voting rights to African American men. However, by the mid-1870s, white supremacists had gained power and imposed Jim Crow laws, leading to racial segregation and discrimination. Signs dictated where black people could go and what they could do. Anti-miscegenation laws banning interracial marriage persisted until 1967, when the Supreme Court ruled them unconstitutional in Loving v. Virginia. Despite these challenges, African Americans began to exercise their rights, vote, seek office, and pursue education during the Reconstruction era. In the decades following the Civil Rights Movement, progress was made in the middle class and in public employment for black Americans. However, issues like poverty and a lack of education persisted amid deindustrialization. Violence against black churches continued, with church fires in the 1990s and a mass shooting in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. From 1981 to 1997, the U.S. Department of Agriculture discriminated against black farmers, denying them loans that were given to white farmers in similar situations. Did you know the discrimination led to legal action and settlement agreements totaling over $2 billion? The war on drugs in the 1980s and 1990s has been criticized as racially biased. Harsh sentencing guidelines disproportionately affected black communities, with much higher penalties for crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine, which was often associated with white Americans. The sentencing disparity was reduced in 2010. Racial tensions between police and minority communities led to riots in cities like Miami in 1980 and Los Angeles in 1992. In recent history, there have been significant events that reflect the ongoing racial tensions in the United States. The election of Barack Obama as the first black president in 2008 was seen as a sign of progress, but the election of Donald Trump in 2016, who had propagated racist conspiracy theories, raised concerns of racial backlash. Racial issues persisted, with the emergence of the alt-right movement, white nationalist groups, and an increase in white supremacist violence identified as a leading threat of domestic terrorism. Racial stereotypes and divisions also continued, impacting communication and media portrayals. Incidents like the Trayvon Martin shooting in 2012, the police shooting of Michael Brown in 2014, and the national outcry that followed, leading to the formation of the Black Lives Matter movement. These events highlighted racial bias in law enforcement. More recently, instances of white women calling the police on black individuals have received attention, reflecting the abuse of white privilege. The murder of George Floyd in 2020 by a white police officer ignited widespread protests against racial injustice in the US. These events underscore the ongoing struggle against racism and racial discrimination in the country. In a nutshell, racism in the United States has deep historical roots, and its effects are still felt today. From slavery in the civil rights movement and beyond, this complex history has left a lasting impact on American society. So what steps can be taken to ensure that history serves as a reminder of past injustices while inspiring a more just future? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more engaging historical journeys.